Yo, what's up guys, Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Edge of Eternities for Historic. Now, I don't think Historic is going to be as shaken up as Timeless, and if you missed it, I've done a Timeless set review for Edge of Eternities already, so I'll have a link for that down in the description if you want to check it out. But I still think there's a bunch of cards from this set that are likely to have a pretty big impact in Historic, especially Eldrazi Temple, which I'm going to get to in a second. But yeah, there's some cards in here that I do think could lead to new builds of pre-existing decks, potentially better ones than we've got already. And I also think there's potentially some cards as well that could lead to new archetypes being birthed. Now, I'm not sure they're going to be able to compete with the top tier decks, because one of my worries that I'll get to is that I do feel like the top of the format is really pulling away from the rest of it. But, you know, we'll get to that when I cover Eldrazi Temple. Also, for any MTGA Zone Premium members, I had a brand new article come out yesterday that's basically just a bunch of Theorycraft Theorycraft historic deck lists built around these new cards. So if you want to see what deck lists I'm brewing up for day one of the format and you're a premium member, I'll have a link to that down in the description. But anyway, let's just get straight into it. So they did not pre-ban Eldrazi Temple in Historic, which is kind of crazy to me considering Wizards have said they don't want fast mana in Historic a couple of times. Now I get where they're coming from, because the two pieces of fast mana they have allowed, Eldrazi Temple and Ugin's Labyrinth, are both conditional, right? You can't run them in every deck. But the concerning thing is that the only deck that really runs Ugin's Labyrinth right now, other than that creativity brew I put out, a couple months ago, is Eldrazi. And so the deck that gets to use both of the the two conditional pieces of fast mana that we've got both go in the exact same deck, and basically only that deck, which is a real concern. So this is going to be pretty big, because I do think Eldrazi is one of the better decks in the format already. I still think currently, before the release of Edge of Eternities, Eldrazi is a step below Sorin in the energy decks. But, like we saw from the Arena Championship, this list is from Andre Strasky, and is basically the closest version to a stock list that we've got at the moment, I think. And just adding Eldrazi Temple here really improves a lot. Obviously, you'd have to come up with some trims. I'm not sure what the best trims would be to fit Eldrazi Temple in here, but if you just slot it in straight away, it just improves the deck, right? You can cast Sowing Microspawn ahead of curve, you can evoke Null Drifter on turn 2, you can, get an extra amount for Kozilek's Command and potentially cast it a turn earlier, which is a really big deal. And then, your 7 drops, you can hard cast your Devourer of Destiny and Emrakul's a turn sooner as well, not to mention Syro 7 Deaths in the sideboard. So Eldrazi Temple is just going to really improve current stock lists of Eldrazi, which I think will probably push them up a level to be able to compete with the Sorin decks, because extra speed, especially speed that's difficult to interact with because it's on a land, really makes a big difference for the proactive game plan of these ramp decks as well. Now, having said that, I don't think these stock ramp lists will be the only way to build Eldrazi. I'm personally really excited to look at more low to the ground aggressive builds, because whilst Eldrazi Temple does improve this build, I don't think you're really maximizing it in this deck, because you don't have as many Eldrazi as you could fit in a maybe low to the ground version built around cards like Glaring Freshraker and Eldrazi Linebreaker. So you'd get the additional speed from Eldrazi Temple, but you close the game out way quicker as well, which should help improve your matchups against, proactive infinite combo decks and other decks that the ramp version might struggle against. So I am a little bit scared of this card being in the format, but I'm very excited to just try and test out those different builds and try and figure out the best one. Then next up, we've got a couple new additions for Affinity. Tezzeret Cruel Captain is a card I'm really excited to try in Timeless, and again, in Historic, I think it is potentially going to be better here, obviously, because the general power level of the format is lower, although we do have less good options for ramp in Affinity, in Historic compared to Timeless. But yeah, this is a really interesting card, mainly because of this -3 ability here that just immediately enables you to tutor for, a hate piece. So, you got Tormod's Crypt for graveyard decks, Aether Spellbomb to be able to deal with any creatures, which is especially important in Affinity, because one of my big issues with Affinity is that it doesn't have great options for interaction, really. I think Aether Spellbomb is really nice because you can pair it with Emry, and, that lock specifically is very good against a deck like Auras. When I was playing Affinity, I always felt like the Auras matchup was kind of unwinnable unless you're able to set up Aether Spellbomb plus Emry. But the issue there is you really want to be running 3 or 4 copies of Spellbomb to be able to draw it consistently in that matchup, but then it's not great against a lot of other decks. It's not great against the Lurrus decks, because bouncing a creature is nowhere near good enough, especially if they're running Amp Raptor and Ajani and stuff like that. And, obviously there are some decks not running creatures like the Lotus Field combo deck. So running 4 in your main deck does lead to some dead draws in certain matchups. So Tezzeret being able to just allow you to run a 1-of that you can tutor in the matchup, and then obviously you can run extra copies in the sideboard, really helps to deal with that issue. So just this alone should help improve the matchup against auras and wizards and stuff like that. Then you've obviously got Pithing Needle, which I think is really, really important right now, not only because of Sorin, but also, a number of other cards that are important to shut off as well. And then obviously Stone of Iraq is still very important because Mardu Sacrifice or just the Ajani Bombardment decks are still going to be very popular, whether that's Mardu, 4-color Samwise, or just pure Boros Energy. And obviously this will be particularly good against the more Sacrifice Synergy decks. And then outside of that, you're going to be running, Ornithopter Retrofit Foundry, which I think is really good with Tezzeret because say you go Retrofit Foundry on turn 1 and then you go Tezzeret on turn 3, you can just immediately get Ornithopter to defend the Tezzeret, play it, puts a loyalty counter on it, and then you can chump block and sack it to make a 4/4, gets another loyalty counter on it. Then even if you don't have any other artifacts, you could just activate the Foundry, put another counter on it, get it up to 4, and then you can -3 again, maybe grab another Ornithopter. So it's really good at defending itself in a Retrofit Foundry Ornithopter shell. Then obviously you've got the 0 ability that allows you to untap, so that can help you ramp if you've got Mox Ambers or Moonsnare Prototypes or Springleaf Drums in play. If you're running the 1 ring, you can use it to untap that. And then obviously if you are putting a bunch of artifacts in play, you can potentially get up to the ultimate, which is a really powerful way to close the game out as well. So Tezzeret is interesting because it does solve a few issues like the Aether Spellbomb thing. It should improve your matchup against combo because you can game 1 tutor hate pieces for certain combo decks, which is pretty big. The issue is that the other issue I have with Affinity though is that it does tend to close the game out quite slowly. But having said that, that's only really an issue against the infinite combo decks. So Tezzeret being able to tutor for hate pieces might be able to circumvent that. But either way, I'm really excited to try this out. The main thing I'm trying to figure out here, though, is that obviously you want to be able to accelerate into this. And I still don't think we have great options for acceleration in Affinity. Obviously, most stock lists are running 4 Mox Amber, which is huge. But past that, I don't really feel like we have enough good quality creatures for Springleaf Drum to be run as more than a 1 or 2 of. If we had Memnite, then I'd be very interested in it. And we do also have Moonsnare Prototype, which is probably the way I would try and build it if I do want to have more ways to ramp into Tezzeret, but again, it's still not really that great. And that, in order to ramp into this on turn 3, you would need to have Moonsnare Prototype plus a 0-mana artifact. So it'll be interesting to see the best way to build this, but I do think that Affinity with Tezzeret will be interesting. Then another card that I'm potentially more excited about, because I do feel like it fixes the other issue with Affinity, is Pinnacle Emissary. So the idea here for me is you want to be running this alongside a bunch of 0-mana artifacts. Now obviously most stock lists are already running 4 Ornithopter, 4 Mox Amber, and the awkward thing about that is that the quality of 0-mana artifacts does drop off pretty significantly after that. But I feel like we have enough payoffs for running a bunch of 0-mana artifacts now where you can just get away with running 4 Tormod Script in the main deck. Obviously, there'll be a number of matchups where it doesn't really do much, but there are still graveyard decks in the format, and there are a lot of top tier decks that also just incidentally use the graveyard, so you can still get value off it that way. But yeah, basically the idea here is that you can warp this on turn 1, and then if you just play a bunch of 0-mana artifacts, you get a bunch of artifact tokens in play. And the really, really big thing for me is this can enable you to cast Kappa Cannoneer on turn 2, which is huge. Because like I said, one of the issues that I've got with Affinity, it's good at grinding, it's great at getting on the board quickly early on. You can, you're good at getting hate pieces if you're running Tezzeret or you've got sideboard stuff as well. But you do struggle to close the game out quickly, which again does make certain matchups difficult, especially, if it's difficult to race against decks like Auras if you can't get Aether Spellbomb. It's difficult to race against some of the infinite combo decks, especially game 1, even post-sideboard if you can't keep your hate pieces in play. So getting Kappa Cannoneer down on turn 2 or 3 much more consistently really feels like a big buff to the deck. And like I said, if we go Pinnacle Emissary on turn 1, and we have 2 0-mana artifacts, that'll have 4 artifacts in place straight away because obviously this dies at the end, it gets exiled at the end of the turn because of the warp ability. That's just enough artifacts in play to be able to get a Kappa Cannoneer down on turn 2, which is so huge at closing the game out. And like I said, it's not just Pinnacle Emissary that really incentivizes you to go past Ornithopter and Mox Amber with the 0-mana artifacts. We've got Landlord Navigator, which, if you're running multiple 0-mana artifacts, if you have 2 of them, you can immediately trigger this on turn 2 to get a Thieving Magpie in play. Also, you don't even necessarily need 2 0-mana artifacts, right? If you have an artifact land like a Seat of the Synod or Darksteel Citadel and a 0-mana artifact, that triggers it. If you've got Retrofitter Foundry Ornithopter, you can potentially trigger it without any other artifacts, because if you go Retrofitter Foundry on turn 1, Landlord Navigator on turn 2, then play Ornithopter and sacrifice it to make a 4/4, that triggers it as well. So having 0-mana artifacts is a really good way to immediately start going off with Navigator as well. Obviously, Emery is usually a 4 in affinity lists, but having more 0-mana artifacts increases the amount of times we'll be able to cast it on turn 1, which is really big. And then finally, we've also got Corey Steelcutter, which is on colour with Pinnacle Emissary. And again, this is another artifact that also pays you off for running a bunch of 0-mana artifacts, because you can trigger Flurry immediately to start, producing tokens, which is pretty big. Now, unfortunately, I'm not sure whether this one will be permanent because it's currently suspended in Alchemy. And, obviously, if they do end up nerfing it, which they've said they will, the nerf will carry over for Historic as well, which is a shame. But, sorry, I mean, it's already going to be pretty difficult to fit all of these in. I think you've probably got to pick one to cut. And so Corey Steelcutter are probably the ways to go. But yeah, Pinnacle Emissary seems like a really, really good card if you're running a high density of 0-mana artifacts, which I'm really excited to test out. Then next up, we got Seam Rip, which I think is basically just an enchantment version of Portable Hold. Basically does the same thing. One's an enchantment, one's an artifact. Now, generically, I do think Seam Rip is probably the better card in the current metagame, just because incidental artifact removal is more common than incidental enchantment removal. So if you're just running this as a piece of interaction, which is, something I've been looking to do, there are definitely historic decks where I've wanted to run Portable Hold in recently. This probably seems like the better card. But in terms of decks that really take advantage of this, I think Enchantress is a really big one for sure, because currently, I think the only good 1-mana enchantment piece of interaction we've got is Static Prison, which is decent in Enchantress, I think, but obviously without any other energy synergies, it is just a temporary 2-turn solution to whatever you exile. But now you can run them potentially both together, right? You could run 8 of them, which gives you really good interaction in the early game, which will help a ton against the Lurrus decks of the format. And obviously they both draw off your Sithis and your Enchantress's presence. They'll also make Sanctum Weaver tap for more, so definitely going to be a buff for Enchantress. We also recently got United Battlefront. Finding this off, that is another nice piece of interaction we can do. We can get to help stabilize us. The issue though is that when United Battlefront came out, I did test Enchantress quite a lot, and the deck is powerful, but it just seems pretty poorly positioned right now. I think you're very good against the Lurrus decks, but you really struggle against Sorin because of Invoke the Divine on Saint Elenda, which they can get down pretty consistently early on. You don't clears the game out very quickly, which leaves you vulnerable to infinite combo decks that can beat the 9-life Solemnity Lock or Phyrexian 9-life Solemnity Lock. So I think Seam Rip is going to be an interesting consideration for white removal, just generically, and I do think it's going to be a buff to Enchantress, but I just don't think Enchantress is very well positioned right now. If they do eventually nerf Sorin and Eldrazi, which are 2 matchups that I think are really bad for Enchantress, if then, there's a chance the format gets really dominated by the Lurrus decks, the Ajani Bombardment decks and Auras and stuff like that. In which case, I think Enchantress is definitely a deck that's worth looking at again. In the current metagame, not so sure, but definitely one to remember for future. Then next time we've got a few warp cards which are pretty interesting and historic because they do pair well with some cards that are already seeing play in Felia and Dedicated Dollmaker. Dedicated Dollmaker not so much because it's a mana investment. So for example, Quantum Riddler, the idea here is that we cast it for its warp cost, and if we didn't have anything to do with it, it would just exile, and then we could cast it for 5 mana later, which is a lot. However, if we blink it with a card like Ephemerate or Felia or Dedicated Dollmaker, not only do we double up on the Enter the Battlefield trigger, but we kind of scam the creature in play like we do with Overlord of the Belmerk. So Quantum Riddler is a pretty powerful effect, I think. One of the better warp cards to scam into play. The awkward thing, though, is that it's blue here, and I do think that, Overlord plus Felia and Dollmaker is a powerful and, tried and tested package that is of a historic power level. And so I think it's more likely that the white cards slot into that sort of build because I think, you want to be running Overlord of the Belmerk. if you're running Ephemerate, you probably want to be running Juggernaut Peddler as well, which are some of the best cards to blink. So I don't know if it's really worth going for 3 color, especially because you do need to fit some interaction into this sort of deck, right? You can't just run all Overlords and Quantum Riddlers and Warp cards and just all value stuff, because then you'll just die to decks that are faster than you if you don't have a way to interact. So having said that, I also do think that Ephemerate is way better with these cards than a dedicated Dollmaker. So there's a chance that Overlord of the Bilmerk doesn't synergize. There's not good enough crossover synergy, because having to wait until, turn 4 for a Quantum Riddler or a Starfield Shepherd to scam with a dedicated Dollmaker is significantly worse than using Ephemerate on it, especially because you get, essentially 3 triggers if you get the rebound off Ephemerate as well. But the issue with Ephemerate, I'll bring it. Sorry, I should have brought it up in case people are unfamiliar with it. But the issue with Ephemerate is that I just don't feel like there's enough good targets to blink in Historic right now. It is a very powerful card for sure, but we don't really have any good 1-mana creatures to blink. The 2-mana ones, we've got Juggernaut Peddler as well, but there aren't that many good ones after that. So I don't know. I feel like maybe you slot these sorts of cards into Overlord of the Belmerk dedicated Dollmaker shells, and then, keep the Ephemerate plan on ice until we get better targets to blink with Ephemerate. But I'm really excited to build these either way. Then the other cards, I didn't really talk about the specifics here, but Starfield Shepherd is kind of reminiscent of Ranger Captain of Eos a little bit. You can either get a Plains, which is nice utility if you're missing land drops, or you can get a creature with mana value 1 or less. Now, if Ocelot Pride hadn't been nerfed to 2 mana, this card would be insane, right? Because you could just choose to Guide Pride whenever you wanted. Having said that, Guide of Souls is very good in multiples, even in its nerfed form, so that could be, just a generically powerful option. And then you could have other stuff like, Giant Killer to kill Saint Elender, and maybe Selfless Savior to protect your board. But without Ocelot Pride as a tutor target for this, I'm not really sure it's worth building around at the moment. But obviously, more 1-mana creatures are going to get added, so this is definitely one to keep an eye on going forwards. And then Halia Guided by Light is kind of interesting as well, because, Guide Pride is still definitely playable even with Pride at 2 mana, and this is another way that we can enable that also turns that excess life gain that you get into card advantage as well. So again, I'm not 100% sure, because I don't feel like these slot too well into a current deck, and because of this, ridiculous power level of Sorin and very likely the Eldrazi decks, I don't think this sort of deck will be able to compete. I think the Overlord package works well currently because it's running Sorin, which is like the best mini combo to be running in the format right now. So I'm not sure branching into a more value oriented build would be beneficial. But again, if Sorin and Eldrazi eventually do get rebalanced, again, it seems a bit preemptive talking about Eldrazi when we haven't even had an Eldrazi Temple release. But if we do get Sorin hit, then, Overlord packages will want something else. This could be worth looking at then, I think. And then also one other card that I think is interesting, one other non-creature warp card, is use Social Engineering, which is kind of like an enchantment Field of the Dead sort of effect, which, Field of the Dead incredibly powerful, but one of the main reasons it is powerful is because it's difficult to interact with. And enchantments are pretty risky to run now because of Saint Elender and Invoke the Divine. But I thought it was worth bringing up because, we do have 2 ways that we can scam this into play in Dollmaker and Felia, unlike a lot of other formats. So, that if again, Sorin does get rebalanced, then this could be worth looking at. But right now, an enchantment that you have to do work to make good that can just be killed by Invoke the Divine. Nah, not 100% sure on this. So, yeah. As I've said a few times, I do think Sorin is restricting a lot of new cards and decks being tested, but these sorts of things are worth keeping at the back of your mind for, future formats. Another card that I also do think is interesting with Dollmaker and Felia is Cryogen Relic, because this draws you a card when it enters or leaves the battlefield, so draws you 2 cards if you're blinking it with Felia every turn. Similar sort of thing with Dollmaker, so again, if you're running an Esper list with Overlord, then maybe, but again, the big issue is the Overlord Dollmaker the Overlord Dollmaker Felia package is like the value part of the deck, right? I feel like adding more value cards is a bit awkward. I think I would much rather run a card like Momentum Breaker in this slot that actually gives you interaction, that doubles up your, that gives you good utility for your Dollmaker and your Felias. But again, if you felt like you wanted more value, could consider this, but again, you're splashing a colour and you're adding more value to the deck. But either way, I wanted to highlight it because, Dollmaker Felia is played quite a lot, and I have struggled to find good playable cards that give you good uses for those outside of Overlord, if that makes sense. The next time we've got Lightstall Inquisitor, which is a card I'm really interested in. I don't think it's ridiculously powerful, but the effect is really interesting to me. So it's a 2-1 with Vigilance for 1 mana, which is reasonable stats. It's a good aggressive card for sure. And then when it enters, the opponent picks a card, they exile it, and it basically costs 1 more if it's a non-land, or enters tapped if it's a land. So this is you're getting a lot of value for 1 mana with this card. It's not as tempo positive as a card like Esper Sentinel, because the opponent could obviously just choose to exile a card they don't plan to play anytime soon, and it doesn't disrupt their hand in a way like Esper Sentinel would do. So if this is, if you don't have any other synergies outside of just playing this as a 1-drop, I don't really think it's worth it. But there are a couple of ways that we can make this better. Cards like Aven Interrupter, for example, have shown to be historic playable just if you're using it for its proactive game plan of, using it as like a tempo counterspell sort of thing. But the passive ability on this will also make cards that the opponent exiles with Lightstall Inquisitor cost 2 more to cast, which is pretty interesting. So again, I don't feel like we have enough payoffs here to really make it worth it. But if we do get more cards like in the vein of Aven Interrupter that do tax cards that are exiled, there could be something to that, right? It works as a way to, it's kind of a tempo deck that pressures the opponent and makes it difficult for them to cast their cards. And obviously these are, going to get in for damage in the meantime while the opponent's trying to figure that sort of stuff out. And then additionally, I think it's kind of interesting with Dedicated Dollmaker because, with Overlord, you do ideally want to be running the full 8 of these so that you can go Overlord, find one, and then just, you've got a self-contained value engine there. The issue is if you are running 8 of the blink effects, especially Dedicated Dollmaker is awkward because it's not a playable 2-drop if you don't have 1-drops that you can blink, if that makes sense. So that was why when I was building these kind of Orzhov-based Sorin decks, I would be always really interested in trying to splash green for Oath of Nissa, because having a 1-drop you can blink just makes Dedicated Dollmaker so much better. It makes it a playable turn 2 card that can give you value, because like I said, a lot of these decks I've seen just run blinkable 2-drops, which means you never want to cast Dollmaker on turn 2. It becomes a 3-drop in your deck, which makes it so much worse. So Lightstall Inquisitor could be interesting as a card to blink with Dedicated Dollmaker. Again, we've already got Hopeless Nightmare, which fills a similar role. Obviously, there will be some situations where giving the opponent a card in the graveyard will be worse if they have graveyard synergies, but that sort of effect didn't seem very powerful to me when I was trying it out. So there's a chance that that's the same deal with Lightstall Inquisitor, but the fact this is a creature that can apply pressure is interesting. So again, I'm not confident that this will be worth running right now, but if we get more effects that double up on the taxing ability like Aven Interrupter, or if it ends up being good enough to blink with Dollmaker, it could potentially be worth it. Next time we've got another card I'm really excited for, Consult the Star Charts, and this feels like the kind of cantripping, or it's not even a cantrip, it's much better than a cantrip, but this sort of card advantage spell in control decks, because I've been trying to build more conventional control decks recently that aren't trying to use the Lotus Field scam engine that runs more counter spells, and it just feels like the card advantage, the instant speed card advantage options that we've got in Historic just aren't great. I was still trying to run Memory Deluge, or running a 4-drop in Historic, even in a control deck, is really awkward. This feels like, it's obviously not as good as Memory Deluge at 4 mana, but it's so much more flexible, right? You can cast this on turn 2, you can kick it later in the game. Once you've got more lands in play, this provides you with so much card selection. So this is just super flexible, not embarrassing to cast on turn 2, honestly, which is, the main thing that was the issue with Deluge, is just having to wait until 4 mana to provide you with card selection is really awkward. So yeah, I'm really high on this card. Again, I'm not sure how well positioned Control is right now, especially if Eldrazi does, take off. But yeah, this is the card advantage spell that I've been looking for in a kind of Draw-Go style control deck. So very excited for this one. Could even potentially see this one seeing play in Azorius Flash, because it is so flexible and you can cast it early on. So definitely going to be trying this one out in both Azorius Flash and in, kind of more of a traditional Jeskai control shell as well. The next up we got Biotech Specialist. Now this is one where I feel like the power level is there, but the deck just isn't right now. So when it enters, creates a land token, which I'm not super interested in. I mean, it does technically provide you with some ramp the following turn I mean, it's super slow for historic, but the main line of text I'm very interested in here is whenever you sacrifice an artifact, this creature deals 2 damage to target opponent. This is a lot. 2 damage is a lot, especially if you're running a deck that is just sacrificing artifacts as part of its proactive game plan. Now, the big issue is that there isn't a deck that is doing that right now. Obviously, you can build a deck that does that. You know, I think Only Cult Anvil is the first card that springs to mind, but that card has been unplayable in Historic for years, and the format's gotten so much more powerful. So it's also kind of in awkward colours as well. I don't think there's really many cards in red-green other than like Overcooked or something, which isn't really Historic playable either. So this kind of feels like a card where the power level is there, but the deck isn't really yet. But definitely one that's going to be at the back of my mind. If there is eventually a deck that does want to be sacrificing artifacts as part of its proactive game plan, this gives you a ton of direct damage. And to be honest, maybe it's worth trying to build around and see if we can do it. But again, yeah, I don't know. Historic is super, super powerful right now. And the issue with these sorts of decks in general is that they're very, you know, high synergy, low individual card quality, which I don't think is a great place to be in Historic right now. But definitely one to bear in mind for future, I think. And then next we got Frenzied Baloth. So this is, you know, a lot, very reminiscent of Questing Beast in what it does, right? Spell can't be countered, and it makes your other spells not counterable, which is, you know, pretty important. We've still got Azorius Flesh in the format. Counterspell recently got unbanned. But again, you know, I think the only deck that would really be interested in this is Devotion. If this was a 4-1, it would be a slam dunk 4 of in Devotion, because, you know, it would turn on Fanatic of Ronus, it would draw you cards off Outcast Liberator and Kiora. At a 3-2, I mean, it does provide two green pips. It does make everything uncounterable, so you can maybe consider, if counter spells do start taking off, bring it in as a sideboard card, maybe against Azorius Flash. But the awkward thing there is that Azorius Flash can play around the uncounterable. They run Reprieve, they run Aven Interrupter as well, which gives them ways out of it. I don't think Devotion is particularly well positioned right now, and obviously with Devotion, you want to be running a Karn sideboard, right? You want to be dedicating the majority of your sideboard to artifacts. You don't really want to be main decking this either, so again, I don't think this is a card that has a great home right now, but I do think it's Historic playable in certain metagames. So yeah, another one to bear in mind going forwards, I think. And then finally we've got Pinnacle Starcage, which is kind of reminiscent of Temporary Lockdown a bit, but it doesn't exile enchantments, which is notable. So this is quite interesting because I have been building Enchantress recently where I wanted to run Temporary Lockdown because it is an enchantment that's very good against the Lurrus decks. But the issue there is that you also want to be running a bunch of cheap enchantments. Your Sithises, your Sanctum Weavers, Sterling Groves, you know, we saw earlier, Seam Rip and stuff like that. So Pinnacle Starcage is pretty interesting if you're running Enchantress and you want a sweeper that doesn't interfere with your own stuff, if that makes sense. It's a little bit awkward that it's an artifact rather than an enchantment, so it doesn't, you know, draw your cards off Sithis and Enchantress's presence and stuff like that. But, you know, that doesn't really matter if you just want a card that sweeps the opponent's board and doesn't hit any of yours. So again, maybe this is another card that helps push Enchantress a little bit further. But again, I feel like it's just making the deck better against the Lurrus decks, but it doesn't really help against the other side of the format. You know, your combo decks, your Eldrazi, you know, the 7-mana recent Ugin that we got is going to be devastating against Enchantress once that gets going. So, yeah, definitely one to bear in mind for Enchantress going forwards, especially if the format does get to a point where maybe Surin gets nerfed and the format goes back to Lurrus decks. But, you know, definitely one to bear in mind and just a good option for sweepers in future. So those are all the cards that I think are likely to see Historic play. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there are any I missed out, because I did, like I said, I always go through the spoiler, and there were quite a few cards that I looked at and thought, that could be interesting, but realistically probably won't see play. But the set's big. Definitely let me know in the comments if you think there's anything I missed out. And also, if there's any applications of the cards that I mentioned that I didn't speak about, definitely let me know, because it's, you know, there's so many interactions. Historic's such a big card pool that I'm sure there are some potential combos or interactions with other cards that I completely missed. So if there's any, definitely let me know in the comments. Also, let me know what decks you're thinking of building once the set comes out. I think for me personally, it's just going to be figuring out the best Eldrazi list, and then really excited to try Pinnacle Emissary and Affinity as well. But either way, I'm so stoked for this set, both in Timeless and Historic, and I can't wait to get playing when it goes. And hopefully I'll have a bunch of deck lists to share with you. I've already got Theorycraft decks for Timeless and Historic in MTG's own premium articles, and I'm going to be trying to refine those once the set comes out, and hopefully have a bunch of deck guide videos on those. So hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up.